Hey, it's Arci from Survivor School. Did you know that trauma is not just a mental health problem? It's a whole life problem. It doesn't just impact your mind, it takes a toll on your body, your finances, your relationships, and your ability to grow. Survivor School provides you with the trauma informed tools to help you regain control of your whole life and take control of your future today. Because healing is a journey of 1,000 destinations. Join Survivor School. We'll lead the way.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. This is episode 129, and I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. I'm glad you're here, and I think you will be too when you hear this episode. I was honored and fortunate to have the opportunity to do a pod share with Katie Koestner, who is the host of her own podcast called Dear Katie, Survivor Stories. Katie's podcast was created out of her own rape experience when she was a freshman at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1990. Katie was 18 and she had just had dinner with a guy she'd been dating for a few weeks. They went back to her dorm room after dinner to hang out and talk. That's when he forced himself on her and raped her, even though Katie was telling him no, repeatedly. Katie went public with her story, which soon became a national debate about whether it was really rape. The idea that you could be raped while on a date was hardly spoken about back then. This is a fascinating episode, and I'm thankful that you're here to listen to our discussion. Here's Katie and me in our shared episode.
Hi, everybody. This is Katie Koestner. Welcome back to the Dear Katie podcast. It's such a delight to continue this journey of healing and thrivership with all of you. Today, the special guest is Dave Markel, and Dave has his own podcast. We're kind of co-sharing the space, the listener space on both of our platforms. So for Dave's purposes, I am going to introduce myself and say hello to everybody. For your listeners, Dave, I am Katie Koestner. When I was on the cover of Time magazine at age 18, it was the case that no one before me had spoken out nationally and publicly as the victim of what was termed date rape. I was a first-year student at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and the third weekend was invited out on a date by a very, I'll say, Prince Charming-like guy. And I was a virgin. I was raised by my FBI dad, very conservative family, very strict, missed one on the SAT type of girl, and was thinking the best. And then after this very expensive dinner at a French restaurant, we went back to my dorm because I did not want to go to frat parties and didn't want to go to his room and didn't want to go drink at bars. And so completely sober, I go back, and that is where my life changed forever. And I really tried very hard to find not only justice for myself, but for as many other survivors as possible. And that's how I've spent the last 33 years of my life. So I am delighted to also be on your show, Dave. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Katie. I totally appreciate you being part of my show and allowing me to be part of yours. For your listeners, I'm Dave Markel, and I am the host of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories podcast. I started my career in law enforcement clear back in 1983 with a little tiny town outside of Denver called Lafayette, Colorado, and worked my way from patrol into investigations about 3 years later and was a investigator for 15 years. So I was with the Lafayette Police Department for a total of 18 years. My specialty in investigations evolved into being the lead investigator for the family violence team. There was me and one other detective. Most of what I investigated was domestic violence, rape, sex assault, and child sex assault and child abuse. I took early retirement in 2001 so that I could start my own training and consulting business because I realized that much of the law enforcement realm was not investigating rape and sex assault cases in a thorough manner. In fact, a lot of these cases, as you know, that's what your story is about, Katie, is the way that these cases are blamed on the victim. They are disregarded and totally unbelieved sometimes. And as in the case of you and many of the people who were surrounding you, not believing what you had to say, I wanted to make a difference. And so I started my own training and consulting business. That eventually led to me being hired by the Army in 2009 And I was a highly qualified expert working with some amazing mentors where I actually learned, I think, a whole lot more in that 6-year period working with the Army than I did as an investigator, because I became aware of what it really means to be trauma informed. Although I think I was probably more trauma informed than most investigators when I was in law enforcement, but really understanding that terminology and the neuroscience of trauma and memory and what goes on in the brain when a rape or sex assault occurs and how things completely change and how it affects our lives in ways that we aren't even aware of, because rape or sexual assault, being such a horrific and personal trauma, really affects every cell in our body. And we carry that with us for the rest of our lives in some way, form, or fashion.
I thought it was really interesting because 83 is quite a while ago. And I also want to think about how you became so well informed. You definitely had tons and tons of interactions with survivors in your space. Do you also have a degree where you've studied and done research? On my podcast, we bring on those who have no practice and lots of theory, and we also have practitioners. So how would you classify your knowledge base?
I think most of it came from being an investigator and working with victims and survivors on a one-on-one basis and interacting with them and how that impacted their lives in the criminal justice system. But as that evolved and I moved out of investigations and decided to work myself into the training and consulting business as an independent, I read tons of information, as much as I possibly could. But then when the Army hired me and I started being around people that were trauma informed and were teaching trauma informed, Dr. David Lisak, Dr. Jim Hopper, in Violence Against Women International, Joanne Archambault, and her research psychologist, Kim Lonsway, they taught me an awful lot. And also reading, for instance, The Body Keeps the Score and other books along those lines. While I was working for the Army, though, I was so intrigued by all of this. I had never graduated from college out of high school. I dropped out after 2 years. But now, working in the capacity that I was working and learning what I was learning, I decided to go back to school and I got an undergraduate degree in psychology. Not because I ever wanted to become a clinical therapist, but because I wanted to learn as much as I could about human psychology. There may be a day when I go back and get my master's degree. Right now, I'm not interested in that because I'm so involved in working my podcast and trying to get the word out through my training and consulting business about what it means to be trauma informed and what it means to understand the neuroscience of trauma and all the impacts that go on in the brain. That's kind of a background on me.
Yeah, that's super helpful, Dave. I really appreciate it because like my kind of similar story is I was a chemical engineer Japanese major. I started college and that was what I was ready to be uber geek forever. I loved thinking and doing math problems and science, and whatever's hard, I would do it. But then this came along and I think it dug into me so deeply in every way of injustice, and then also realizing how little had ever been done so far in the world. And especially since you and I were starting our work in this area before the internet, we had to go to the library and see what books were available in the card catalog. And then, beg somebody's access to the various journals at the time. But I like thinking about you so much because you are one of the original practitioners. You just embraced this. So I just have one last question before we go to what you're doing now is, what do you think led all these survivors to talk to you, and how in that small town outside of Denver, Lafayette, I think you said, like, how was it that there were so many survivors coming forward and that you became the designated point person for those cases?
It happened through a couple of things. First of all, just the aspect of being a police officer and a detective who, before we developed the family crimes unit, there were only 3 detectives. We rotated who was on call. So anytime there was a child abuse, a child sex assault, a rape, a domestic violence case that needed an investigator, I ended up getting a lot of those cases through that rotational basis of being on call. But also the other detectives were not interested in that aspect of investigation because it's an extremely difficult and time-consuming type case to work, in the sense that you have to be empathic. You have to be a good listener. And I think my personality had a lot to do with that. If I really get honest with the entire picture of things, being empathic not only had to do with the way that I was brought up and being a third child and being in a very controlled family setting, but also from the sexual assault experiences that I had as both a child and as an adult. And I was afraid to tell anybody about what had happened to me. When I finally did, and there were people who, like you, some believed me, some supported me, some didn't, I kind of took the attitude of, well, if anybody ever tells me about this kind of thing, I'm certainly going to believe it. I'm certainly going to take the viewpoint and perspective of being empathic, being a good listener, getting all of the facts and information. And it just affected the way I approached these cases and these investigations to the point where I was much more willing to put the belief side of things on a victim than a perpetrator, because I had learned early on in my police career that criminals lie about their criminal activity. They don't, when you catch them, they don't go, yep, I did it. They go, no, I didn't do that. So you just learn early on that people who do crimes, especially crimes against other people, like interpersonal violence, they deny, blame, and they minimize.
Hi, this is Katie Koestner, and I wanted to remind all of our listeners about the free National Sexual Assault Legal Hotline. We at Take Back the Night have assembled an incredible team of attorneys, trauma-informed, who truly believe survivors and want to support their journeys in healing and finding justice. The Get Justice hotline is 567-SHATTER, or feel free to fill out a form on the Take Back the Night website, share your story, let the attorneys know what's going on, and they will get back to you as soon as possible with all of your legal options. That is a service we are delighted to provide through Take Back the Night. Thank you first for sharing your own survivorship. But now my brain is going so fast because I'm thinking, my goodness, you just said you didn't go to college. So you must have started your law enforcement career shortly after high school. And that means like you already had this empathy going. And how did you have any way to identify what you had been through personally at such a young age? Like that you already, by the time you were 18 or 19 at least, knew that this was something you wanted to do better for others because you'd already been there yourself.
First of all, I did go to college right out of high school.
Oh, you did, and then you stopped.
But I didn't graduate. I dropped out after two and a half years. And my career path at that time was not involved in law enforcement, and it wasn't involved in psychology at all. I was a music major and studying voice performance. I wanted to be an opera.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh my gosh, that's so fun, Dave. That's awesome. Kudos to you, because my sister sang opera, and I can barely open my mouth. I don't know if I could hold a tune. My music is clarinet and sax and piano, but no singing.
Well, mine was trumpet and voice, but it didn't work out for me because I was horrible at music, especially music theory and music history. And I was at Baylor University, one of the best music schools in the country.
In Texas. Oh, my goodness.
I was raised in El Paso, but I had heard about Baylor and heard that they had an amazing music school, and they did. And it was kind of like the Juilliard of the West kind of thing. And I went there, but it was not my bailiwick. I could sing, but I couldn't make sense of the theory. I couldn't play the piano, which was required. I was horrible at remembering history and things like that. So it became obvious to me that I wasn't going to be a professional musician. Once I got into law enforcement, like I said, I had this history of sexual assault as a child and didn't tell anybody. But I knew in my heart that if I did, I probably wouldn't be believed. I would probably be stigmatized and ridiculed and made fun of. I just kept it a secret. And then it wasn't until I became a detective, still I wasn't telling anyone. Even before I went into law enforcement, I was working out in California and was sexually assaulted by one of my bosses, a supervisor of mine in the warehouse. And I was also sexually assaulted while I was at Baylor by a colleague, another student. Those I didn't tell anybody about either. So when I finally got into training and consulting, I'll be honest with you, Katie, I didn't tell anybody about my sexual assaults until I became a highly qualified expert working for the Army.
Oh my goodness, Dave. That's like, it's so powerful You know what you're telling, I think our listeners, so many. Yeah, I know. I wanted to just like honor, we have some guests who apply, Dave, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, I can't out myself as a survivor. Kind of what you're talking about.
Right.
Like they want to be on the show. They get all the way to the door and they're knocking and we open it and then they run away. It's terrible. I'm so proud of you for like coming out. I'll say coming out, like you're willing to say I'm a male survivor. It's so powerful.
Yeah. Well, I'd been spending my entire career encouraging victims to report. And I had never reported mine. I never told anybody. And I was telling people all the time, you know what? You'll feel better if you tell your story. And yet I hadn't. And so I don't know what inspired me. I was standing in front of class one day, teaching at Fort Leonard Wood in front of this 2-week Special Victims Unit investigations course. I was teaching a classroom full of military investigators. And it just struck me. I need to tell these people I'm a victim too. I'm a survivor. I was a victim and now I'm a survivor. And I was just embraced. I had so many people start telling me their own stories because I had told mine. It inspired me to, once I got into the training and consulting realm after I got out of working for the Army, which was a 6-year appointment, I was traveling around the country doing trainings and consultings of the same type. And these 4 women up in upstate New York approached me after one of my trainings. They were on a panel that I listened to, and they had heard my presentation earlier that day. And they said, are you teaching to victims and survivors the same information that you're teaching to investigators and advocates and prosecutors and mental health workers? And I said, no, I've never specifically taught victims or survivors. And they all 4 of them at the same time said, you need to start a podcast. And that was the birth of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. It took me 7 years after they said that to get up the courage to do that and get rid of my own imposter syndrome issues and fear of talking into a microphone. But once I started, Katie, I went from an audience of about 50, 60 people early on in my podcast to now an audience every month of pushing 4,000, and it's still growing. So that's to me
so awesome.
Is huge. Yeah. And people tell me through texts and emails all the time what an amazing impact this podcast is having on their lives. It's fueled my soul. I had heard of you, but I had kind of lost track of your story. I remember the fact that you were on the cover of Time until I re-saw your podcast and started reading about some of the information and what you had been doing. I just knew I had to have you on my show. To have you here is a huge honor because of the impact that you've had for 30 plus years in the realm of educating
so
people.
Crazy.
I know, but it's amazing. You are saving lives and you are changing the culture. We have this severe issue of rape culture in our country where the societal belief systems and the way the criminal justice system approaches these cases, even investigators who aren't empathic and who don't understand what it means to be trauma informed, they're actually doing more harm to victims and survivors in the way they're handling these cases. And it's my goal and aspiration to change that culture as much as I possibly can. So I wanted you on the show. I wanted people to hear your story. I wanted people to know what you're doing, the Take Back the Night and the movie.
Sure thing.
Everything. So let's talk about you. So,
okay. Yeah, I think, David, I think we could do it in some of the milestones. And I'd like to tie them into accessible milestones for everybody, because one of the things I say a lot is you don't need a degree to be an activist, and you don't need anything at all except your voice to change the world. So don't think you have to have a certain skin color. You don't need to be a certain faith or political party in this day and age, or ethnicity, all of it. To me, because I was 18, and I think if we start with how accessible that needs to be, there are survivors who are literally children. And I was at least old enough to have a life plan. And so I go out into the world with a system of understanding, do what's right, help other people, get good grades, don't mess anybody else's life up and work as hard as you can. So I had a basic understanding of what was meritus. And then here I am, and I am violated to the very core of everything that I believed in, which was I was kind to this guy. I was generous. I was trying to be nice to him. I was still trying to get a great education, and to be raped as a virgin and have all that just thrust out the door. And the trauma of it, right? The trauma is different for each of us, but the impact for me in particular was a complete loading of, first and foremost, violation. And secondly, when I delved into exactly what this was, and every time I tried to get help from my RA, who was really helpful, but then onto the medical care at the college and the dean and then friends and then my own parents and the justice system, like all of it was, sometimes it was denial. Sometimes it was like, you're going to have to really overcome a lot of burdens of proof. And sometimes it was just plain from my parents, especially like blame. Like, we raised you, we thought you were smart. What the heck happened to you?
Exactly.
So that's where it started. But then, Dave, seriously, I think I made one big choice, which was, how could I deal with all this turmoil, and what would I be willing to give up for it? And the simple deciding factor was, I thought he would do it to another person, another woman after me. And if I did nothing and didn't try, I knew exactly how I felt. And I would live forever with guilt and shame myself, even if no one believed me. And then, so easy peasy. Like, I sought every single avenue. I proved my point. I read the fine print in the handbook. I backed up every argument. I sat in the hearing room all by my lonesome and defended myself and won. And he admitted that I told more than 12 times. And then further injustice. So I became an advocate, not just for myself, but for the cause. And the more I spoke, I wrote letters to the editor. It was like real old school. I didn't do social media.
Right.
And the backlash was tremendous. There were 2,000 people who signed a petition that said I lied at my college when HBO was making a movie about my story, to say, don't make this movie, Katie's a liar. They covered my car with honey and baby powder. They threw eggs at my windows. They broke into my apartment and rearranged stuff. Like, it was one thing after another. But the greatest thing about how insanely determined I am, the harder people fought against me, the more determined I became. It became like, I am smart enough to win. I am going to figure out how to outwit, outsmart, outlast, get more A's. And it wasn't, I want more television. I Oprah invited me, Larry King invited me, all the shows, just, it was a deluge of invitations, old school, like on the voicemail.
Right.
And the ones I go on, they'd show up and follow you around with the like more scandalous ones. And I did it. I got straight A's and I did it.
That's amazing in and of itself, that you maintained and had that motivation.
I loved it. But that kept me sane, Dave, because if you have some sort of metric of someone at least knows that you're just as smart as the person in your class, and what are we here for? It's college, and I can get all these A's and go change the world and take red eyes to Stanford and back and go give a lecture and read and soak it all in and volunteer on the hotline. And I couldn't sleep anyway from 11 to 7 a.m. So I did the hotline. I got trained. I took in every single thing, Dave. And then I kept going. That was college. Then I was like, maybe I should go to law school. And then, that's money and time. Don't have time for that. So I just kept speaking. I'm like, let me just go speak to as many high school students for a year as possible. And 1 year turned into 2 and 3. And now I've been to 5,000, and then Take Back Nike Long. It's all good. It's like I fit on a plane still. But you sleep in the airports. When you're an activist and you're a diehard, you sleep in your car. You go through ice storms and snowstorms to get the school in Michigan because the college doesn't close in the bad weather. I go trail running. I broke my shoulder one morning in Utah. But luckily, I like being on a stage because I don't have to see the people, which sounds crazy. No. But when the lights are on, you're just telling the story. You're rallying the crowd. You're figuring out how to connect with every single human every day. And that is fierce, feisty, and I love it. So that's me, Dave. I'm not like a big fan of going on TV.
Right,
Like,
right.
I don't even know, like making movies. The thing I love the most is one-to-one with humans. And I like being for 37 and a half minutes. So I have full attention. Like, who gets that? It's such a privilege.
It is. That's amazing. I do want to know, Katie, from your perspective, what that healing journey involved with you, because I talk a lot about this with victims and survivors who've been through all of this, and they go through intrusive thoughts and horrific nightmares and reliving the trauma over and over again and get somewhat stuck in that until they finally get into some form of either therapy or have someone that they can talk to, or they decide to tell their own story as you have. Did you go through that kind of therapy, or was your therapy taking on that?
Do. Yeah, it's do, Dave. And I'd love to hear the same from you because you're also a male and I'm a female. And also, like, trauma is like separate and different for everybody. I've shared a little bit on my own podcast, but that rape I went through was unfortunately not the first bad thing that ever happened. And I had packed it all away. My whole childhood was full of like craziness. But because, I mean, it's, if you just start with, it's not a movie. Your dad's really flying on a hijacked plane to Cuba and he's undercover and he has a name and you don't know where he is for 2 weeks. And I grew up dad was a Superman. I mean, he's still alive. Like, I grew up having a Superman in my house.
Yeah.
But I also grew up with a lot of turmoil in my house and a lot of crazy other stuff in my house because a lot of people who are extraordinary have a lot of craziness.
Hey, it's Arci from Survivor School. Did you know that trauma is not just a mental health problem? It's a whole life problem. It doesn't just impact your mind. It takes a toll on your body, your finances, your relationships, and your ability to grow. Survivor School provides you with the trauma-informed tools to help you regain control of your whole life and take control of your future today. Because healing is a journey of 1,000 destinations. Join Survivor School. We'll lead the way.
So I tucked it all away. So to answer your question, like, how do I deal with trauma? Trauma means constantly filling every single moment so you don't go backwards. Here's a good example. I love running. I still love running. But if you run, you can replay that movie, that nightmare in your head every second. If it's not immersive, then your mind can drift. You're going to go right back to trauma. And then the other thing I did was I just did everything possible. Why did this happen to me? Okay. I have all these things I can do that I'm gifted with that I can do to help. If I run out, I'll find some more. And then the third thing I think is I reprogram some of the trauma, like the smell of his cologne. You just douse yourself and all your friends for a week. And then the solution to pollution is solution, right? It's somewhat hard though. If your perpetrator was a smoker and you smell smoke, you can't necessarily change smoke unless maybe you smoke a pack yourself. Like, I want to develop bad habits, but you want to reprogram those trauma centers and triggers so that they're not anymore. I was allergic to broccoli because I had broccoli at dinner that night. My whole body was never, ever, ever eat any of these things ever again because something dramatic and terrible is going to happen.
Right.
So I had to almost microdose what I had for dinner that night. So I eventually wasn't recoiling over in pain from stomach cramps. It's crazy. You said, the body keeps the score, truly. I think you asked a good question, and I think I said it a little more clearly than maybe I usually do, but I gave part 1, 2, and 3. So what about you? How did you do it? You're in 2 different spots. You described Baylor people and childhood people. So how did you work it through?
I will be as transparent about this as I can. And part of this has to do with the complexities of personality and the complexities of working through our own issues. I, too, was in a tumultuous childhood growing up, and not only through the sexual assault that I endured and the rape, but also had a father who's now deceased, and my mother is also deceased. So I don't mind telling people this. There's no harm in this now as far as them being harmed or them being upset. But my dad was both emotionally and physically abusive. My mom was unable to protect me and my siblings from that abuse other than to comfort us afterwards, but she couldn't intervene. It would mean harm to her. As I mentioned, I think that had a lot of impact on how I looked at other people and how I wanted to interrelate with other people. I became an empath. I became someone who tried to please people all the time because I was trying to please my dad so I wouldn't get harmed, either emotionally or physically. I was trying to be the child that my parents told me I should be in terms of our religious upbringing, which I don't think is a bad thing at all, but I'm just saying that because it had a huge impact on what I was trying to be for others. So when I did get to the point where I was looking at a career in law enforcement, probably 3 or 4 psychologists have said the reason I became a cop in the first place was because of my past, was because of my abuse, was because of my sexual assault, and that I was just trying to reach out to others to help them in ways that I wished somebody had helped me. So that was unbeknownst to me. I wasn't aware of that kind of psychological process going on in my head. I just followed my heart and realized that I could help people in that way, especially through interpersonal violence, the child sex assaults, the child abuses, the adult rapes and sex assaults and domestic violence. I just poured my life into doing everything I could to helping others and learning the criminal justice system as best I could to be that kind of person that was helping others. That was a coping mechanism. As far as I can look back and see, that's what kept me motivated and going and gave me therapy. So when I did get into working very closely with the people I mentioned before, those mentors, those who have a really good insight and study the neuroscience of the brain and the memory and all of that and how trauma impacts all of that, I just absorbed it and was a sponge. I wanted to suck that in and become as knowledgeable as I could to then further my own healing, but also pass that on to others, as well as educate others to help reduce the prevalence of rape and sex assault and change the culture.
That's so awesome, Dave. I mean, I think you did pour yourself in, as you said. And how do you keep yourself whole and safe in hearing all these survivor stories?
I think years and years of experience and the way I dealt with coping mechanisms in handling these cases for 15 years plus, 3 years in patrol, but then 15 years as a detective, my coping mechanism for dealing with domestic violence offenders and child sex offenders was making those arrests and getting some sort of personal satisfaction in hearing the handcuffs click around their wrists, putting them.
Oh gosh, that's so fun. That sounds like out of a movie.
I know. Putting them into my patrol car or my detective car, and me personally, instead of handing them off to a patrol officer to take over to Boulder and put them in jail, I drove them. It was a therapeutic coping mechanism for me.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, this is.
I love it. You're like revenge artist in disguise.
Yeah. I'm putting the bad guy in jail, and that was a huge.
I know. That's
huge
so awesome.
therapeutic thing for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear it in your voice too. I mean, I think it's so interesting because usually there's a story behind for all of us, you know, about what brings us to the place we are and how we act and what we do. Then there's also, you know, I would say the ones I've met who are just like child molesters, addicts. Like they're addicts like the way a drug addict is. They just groom and carve it out, and that's the only way they live. They are true addicts.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lifestyle.
Yeah, a lifestyle. That's a really good but bad way. You know, it's horrific. It's a lifestyle that they just think they can keep doing. At worst, it's just this culture. I think you mentioned it, rape culture. It's just like, this is how you work a yes out. This is what real men do. You get the girl to give in, or the person. I don't know. But those are just my, like, you have much more experience than I. What do you think?
I think you're spot on. And that it's a perpetual problem, that everything you just mentioned is still occurring. It occurred back when you were 18. When was that?
I was 18 in 1990.
90. Okay. So
91.
Since 91, not a whole lot has changed in our rape culture. We still are fighting this whole concept. For instance, the swimmer from Stanford whose judge gave him 6 months prison, and he only served 3 of that because of good behavior. when in actuality, he should have been sentenced to 14 years in prison or more.
Yeah,
We
I
have
think
this.
his father came in. Don't you remember that one? His father came in and said, "But my son's such a good swimmer and a good boy."
Yeah, why are you going to? We can't ruin this boy's future. Well,
Yeah.
nobody paid any attention to the victim's future or what she had gone through and all the abuse that she went through, as you did after the sex assault. You were repeatedly traumatized by the way you were treated.
Well, but some people would turn that around and say, you didn't have to be that explosive with your opinions. You didn't have to go shout it from the mountaintop. You brought it on yourself.
Well,
There's all kinds of attitudes.
yeah, there's trolls who are going to say that, and those who take the side of the perpetrator mentality, which perpetuates that rape culture that I'm talking about. We are so ingrained, as you mentioned earlier, that males are aggressive, males are this, males have to do that. And it feeds into this whole concept of hypermasculinity and privilege that they feel towards women, that's what women are there for. And it just perpetuates the problem over and over and over again. I think it just takes someone like you and like me and like all the other people that are doing what they're doing to reduce the rate of prevalence in rape and sex assault in our society and change the core culture and ideas about what rape is into the reality of it being a offense against anybody that gets raped, male, female, transgender. It doesn't matter. When you're taking advantage of somebody sexually because you feel like you have that right, we need to change that culture.
Where are we going to let's talk about that when we kind of wind up, because so I always like, where to next, where to from here. And I love your podcast and I love helping survivors exercise their voices, but I'm worried that we're not moving the dial on the people with the power. How are we going to do that, Dave? How are we going to do that?
One of my big themes with sexual assault survivor stories, and I've just started pushing this more and more, is that we have to normalize this conversation. And by normalize the conversation, I mean we have to let victims and survivors tell their story, to empower them, to believe them, and to support them. So when more people talk about it, like what you're doing, which is, again, why I needed you on my show, because you are such an influence. When we empower victims and survivors to talk about it more, and it becomes the normality of our society that we recognize rape and sex assault for what it is, that's when things start changing. It's hard, like you said, because what we're trying to do is change the people with the power. But the best way to do that, from my perspective, is to empower, support, and strengthen victims and survivors' voices. Give them a platform to tell their story and to eventually change the mindset of those who are in power and who do have the broken mindset that rape is okay, that sexual assault is okay, and get the word out that it's not, and that it is a crime, that it is an offense against a person's core being. The more we educate, the higher the chance that those people with power will finally come to terms. That's why I love what you're doing, the Take Back the Night idea and all of that movement.
Yeah.
Coupled with the Me Too movement, we've got to keep that power and that generation of process going over and over and over again.
Okay, let's just talk about another thing though. Me Too, it sounds good, but I was worried. I've always been worried. It sounds like it looks to me like a bunch of celebrities, all the pretty people came out finally and said, me too, me too, me too. But it didn't feel as inclusive and universally welcoming as I wished. I would only say what's really cool. I didn't start Take Back the Night. It started like 50 some years ago. And I just brought together all the event holders. And here's what I do think would be cool. Take Back the Night, here's what it is for those who don't know and are listening. It is a movement to start. It's very inclusive and diverse, although when it started, it relegated anyone who identified as male either out of the marches or to the sidelines, because the concept of violence against women was so huge and so ouchy for women to, because almost 90 some percent, 90, most all of them were assaulted by men. Right.
Right.
So, and men, unfortunately, we weren't even like you as an awesome male survivor. We were not even ready to think about male sexual abuse at that moment. And you're one of the awesome men who did. So if we go back and we just say it, like, luckily the movement involved, what I still think is so magical about it is, one, it's grassroots as heck. There are, I wouldn't say pop-up shops, but there's like no requirement. You can do it at a Baptist college. You can be on your ancestral territory. Like, you can be in Canada, you can be in Portugal, and then what does it consist of? It's an event of your choosing that demonstrates either definitely support for survivors, but some sort of theme. Are you trying to change the laws and policies? Are you trying to say this particular case went upside down? Or you terrible power mongers that are keeping this issue silent? You pick your own local relevant place to start. Maybe it's like we walk around the track of our high school for every time that we did a survey and we found out that 183 students at our school out of 580 were assaulted. So we're going to walk enough times to represent that statistic. It's very relevant. And then it also embraces music. Like, you're an opera singer. It embraces, like, I've been to events where there's a cappella groups, there's rock out guitar players, there's harmonicas. Like, there's one, and I can remember there's like an accordion player in this school in Georgia. There's dance troupes, there's ballerinas at the one in Greenwich. It is an expression of, there's a prayer. Like, okay, maybe we have Hindus and Buddhists and Baptists all come together and all say a prayer. It's so gorgeous to me, because where we started earlier in the conversation, Dave, was like, how do we work our way out of trauma? And working our way out of trauma is finding joy. It's finding happiness again. What's going to lift our hearts and our souls and get us out of this hardship? How many miles should we swim in the ocean or in the lake? How far should we go collect daisies and leaves? Like, to me, the magic of life is the creative spirit, as well as the science and the analysis of it. So it's like Renaissance healing to me. And I'm just saying, like, how I feel about it. To me, it's the coolest thing. We do all kinds of cool stuff. We help the beatboxers. We're working in India. We're not doing a lot of corporate stuff. We don't have corporate sponsors like RAIN, and we don't have a lot of government grants because that's oversight and control. I'm not trying to say I'm a communist, but I'm just saying we're such a cool, wicked group of all gender survivors and healers and supporters. And everybody's a volunteer. We had our celebration yesterday, believe it or not, Dave, almost 2 hours.
Wow.
It was, all the volunteers just came together online and we shared these positivity and what else can we do? And the youngest was 14. Yeah, it's so cool. So anyway.
I guess my message and all of what you're saying, your take on Me Too, is that I was thrilled when Me Too happened, just because it just brought another level of awareness out. And there were so many, not just celebrities, but even down to the grassroots, everyday layperson from tiny little towns to huge cities saying, hey, me too, this happened to me. And it gave them a voice. And
or a way of saying it. I think you're right. A way of saying it.
Right. And to me, regardless of gender, regardless of the name of the organization or the movement, Take Back the Night, Me Too, there's so many great organizations out there who are raising awareness. And to me, that's everything. That's why I said that I think it's a grassroots movement of making the conversation an everyday conversation, so that we actually have to transform our brains, because our brains are designed and biologically programmed to keep us alive. That's the number one goal of your brain. The psychology in that is that when you hear of something that sounds threatening as rape and sexual assault, which oftentimes do result in murders after the rapes or after the assaults, people don't know when they're being raped whether or not they're going to live through it. And in certain ways, parts of their bodies don't, parts of their minds don't live through it. They are stuck and destroyed and damaged so much that they don't know what to do. So in normalizing that conversation with regard to what's going on psychologically in the brain, We have to make our brains realize that when someone starts talking about rape or sexual assault, we don't shut them down. We don't look for ways to avoid it. We don't look for pathways to run away from that. Instead, we normalize it to the point where we're all embracing it and we start believing. That's why I love End Violence Against Women's movement of start by believing. And that whole concept of if somebody's telling us that they were raped or sexually assaulted, don't immediately go to, oh, I bet she made it up, or I bet he made it up. It was just bad sex. It was just a way of dealing with the fact that there was a misunderstanding. They wanted it, but then they changed their mind halfway through, or at the end, they decided, oh, I shouldn't have done that. No, that's not what rape is. Rape is someone taking advantage of someone else, and we've got to program our brains to accept what we commonly call taboo, that whole concept of talking about rape and sex assault, to the point where all these platforms, the one that you're helping with, the one that Ray Epstein at Temple University regenerated student activists against sexual assault, the SASS program, turned it from a few people on campus to now over 500 members, because of her passion towards normalizing this conversation and getting the word out. And Ashley Bendixson and so many others out there who are really pushing to normalize this and talk about it. That's how things start changing. That's how our brains actually biologically start reprogramming and accepting that rape is rape and we need to talk about it. I don't think we'll ever prevent it, but I think we need to reduce the prevalence rate so much that people think twice before they rape again.
I'm worried we could talk for just like 2 hours.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not worried, but I know we could. What do you think about lawyers who think the biggest deterrent is court sentencing and prison? I think we still have a culture of privilege, and nobody with enough money thinks they're going to go to jail.
That's an offender mentality issue. That's a whole nother podcast in and of itself. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in our discussion, is that when people are raised or somehow maladjusted in their mindset growing up, that taking advantage of someone sexually, taking a mindset of, I can do this, taking sex without permission, I can do this, it's okay. And then our society amplifying that belief system, because we join in their minimization, we join in their denial, and we join in their blame of the victim. And instead of allowing that minimization and blaming and denial to occur, we need to say, no, we're stopping that. We're going to change offender mentality. Again, I'll go back to saying the way you change offender mentality is to normalize the conversation and get more victims and survivors to talk about it. I mean, there's studies out there that show that if victims and survivors are supported right off the bat and believed, it impacts the rest of their life in positive ways. If they are not believed and they're blamed, it impacts them to the point where every aspect of their life becomes a detriment. Their finances, their interpersonal relationships, their jobs, their health, everything is impacted negatively if we're not believing and supporting victims and survivors. That's what I want to change.
Yeah, that's awesome, Dave. You're amazing. I'm so glad we met and came across one another.
Me too. This is amazing. And I hope we can keep this conversation between us going too. I would love to have you back on my show and just talk to you more about this stuff. Like you said, we could talk for hours, but I think to embrace, and the thing that I think is so important is that these podcast episodes are out there for perpetuity. And there are victims and survivors who will hear this maybe years from now and gain something from it. And that's my whole goal, is that we are constantly putting information, education, support, and wisdom out to the masses so that our listeners feel embraced. They feel a community of fellow victims and survivors who've been through what they've been through. And that's what I think is so important about your message, and why it's so important to have you on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, because you are going to inspire a few thousand people that tune into my episode each month. But I know that ultimately there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands who are going to hear that episode because it's going to be out there forever. Same with your podcast.
It's so awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dave, you're also, I want to go right back at you, because you're also a hero to especially male survivors, and especially older survivors who still haven't come forward. I can remember when I was on the cover of Time, Dave, the Time magazine gave out my address. So I got a letter. I'm sure she's passed now, but I got hundreds of them from people who had never told anyone. They wrote a letter. And there was one woman, she said, I think she said she's 89. She's a great grandma and she never told anybody until she wrote the letter. I think another message we give our audiences is it's never too late to heal and acknowledge and find a way to make peace and make a healing happen. Keep going. And find a community. Take that it's such an accessible, everywhere in the world kind of community. And if there's not an event near you, you can start one. You can start one at your Rotary Club. You can start one at your church. You can start one anywhere. And then, you have a community. You have something to look forward to every year with that event that's going to give you some strength and bring visibility beyond, your own internal self. So awesome, Dave.
Katie, thank you so much for allowing me to be a guest on your show. And thank you so much for the honor and privilege it is to have you as a guest on my show. This has been amazing.
Likewise. What a cool concept. It's the real deal of podcast swap. Well, to all your listeners, thank you for affording me some space in your ears and your heart and your mind. So keep being strong and look out for more stuff from Take Back the Night. We have a newsletter, a fan club, lots of ways to feel empowered. We even make our episodes into t-shirts. Right. So fun. So not all of them make it, but we have little volunteers make shirts out of episodes. Then we put them in the shop. So
that's awesome.
And together we thrive. Oh, and the last one, I think you should mention this, Dave, on your show, is we do have Take Back the Night has the legal support hotline because you're all into law enforcement. So we have this cool team of attorneys across the country who are trauma informed, who will help with civil cases and also just going over what your options are no matter where you are. So there's a form and a free phone call. So either one works.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm all for that and glad you mentioned that. I'm really glad that you brought that organization and that community within your organization, those attorneys who are providing civil remedies to bring justice to victims and survivors who may not have had that opportunity in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, who knows, but the criminal and civil system keep evolving and changing from year to year. So we will have to do an update a year from now. Thanks so much, Dave.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. It's truly an honor to have had the opportunity to talk with someone whose rape experience has been talked about hundreds of times on several major media platforms over the past 33 years. This has been an astounding encounter for me, and I can't thank Katie enough for allowing me this opportunity. Katie, it truly was an honor to have you on my show and simultaneously be a guest on yours. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. SASS listeners, I also want to thank you for being a part of this SASS listening family and for sharing this podcast with your friends, family, coworkers, and acquaintances. You are doing your share of helping to bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, and I can't thank you enough. It's a privilege to have you with me each week. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, leave a 5-star rating, and drop me a note at dave@sassstories.com to tell me what you thought of today's episode. That's dave@sassstories.com. It would be great to hear from you. Another way to help bring justice to victims and survivors is to start by believing if anyone reaches out to you to tell you their rape or sexual assault experience. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Thank you again for being here, and be sure to tune in next Tuesday for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. We'll see you next week.
All too often, survivors feel stuck on the therapist couch and living one crisis to the next. But at Survivor School, we help you break free from that cycle by offering practical tools to heal your body, your brain, and your mind. We understand that trauma affects every part of your life, and that's why we have trauma-informed experts that can help you with everything from your physical health to your financial security, and from rebuilding trust in relationships to rediscovering what makes you truly happy. I'm Arci Gray, survivor turned CEO, and I started Survivor School because I wanted to bring other survivors the resources that help me break the trauma cycle and start living my dreams. And I invite you to join us. See you there.